At 10 minutes past 7 Pacific Standard Time on the morning of February 13, 2025, a ZK-Class Temporal Cessation event took place. This event would become known in a proposal penned by Dr. Ori as SCP-001. The events of SCP-001 were considered so severe that the O5 Council declared that the Foundation should entirely disregard the normal measures they take to maintain a veil of secrecy, shielding the public from learning about anomalies. In order to urge the SCP Foundation to abandon all notions of secrecy and begin operating in the open, SCP-001 had to have been a catastrophe of such magnitude that even attempting to cover it up was immediately deemed pointless. Something so widespread that it would take too long to administer amnestics to everyone who witnessed the anomalous event, even with the considerable resources at the Foundation's disposal. And in fact, it was. When SCP-001 was triggered, time, as humanity knew it, stopped. The ordinary chronological passage of seconds and minutes, as understood by human society for centuries, suddenly ceased without explanation. The event was instantaneous and widespread, affecting people, animals, and even inanimate objects across the entire world. Everything affected by SCP-001 was suddenly locked in position, unable to move independently. The Foundation scrambled to coordinate a response amongst the few personnel who were left unaffected by the sudden time-halting event. SCP-001 had affected a considerable number of the world's population. However, there was no way of telling exactly how many people had been stuck in time. Those that remained unscathed by SCP-001 were still able to move and interact with the environment around them. However, any natural biological processes had ceased. Not only was the Earth no longer rotating on its axis, nor were plants growing, but humans weren't aging or metabolizing food. To a degree, even those who weren't left frozen in the spot they'd been in were still stuck. The mechanics of exactly how something like this had happened, what had triggered SCP-001, and the full extent of it were almost impossible for the Foundation to ascertain. Conducting any research into the source of this time stopping or any way to restore the natural flow of time was hindered, not only by the amount of Foundation staff who were left trapped by SCP-001, but also by the fact that once secure Foundation communication systems had begun failing across the entire globe. Those personnel who remained unaffected were left facing immense difficulty communicating with each other, with little in the way of options for determining the status of vital Foundation personnel or contacting other sites. There was, however, one remaining option not affected by SCP-001, or rather, technically two. A pair of instances of SCP-6459 were recovered, the collective designation given to a subspecies of domesticated homing pigeons with above-average intelligence, dexterity, and awareness. Thanks to these two anomalous pigeons, the few Foundation agents that remained were able to establish some rudimentary communication using pen and paper messages that were delivered by the pair of SCP-6459 pigeons. Given that nobody was able to mark the passage of time anymore, it became impossible to tell just how long it took to reach out to other Foundation sites. But eventually, it was determined that only 4 remained in the entire world housing personnel who were still capable of conducting operations. Of the 4 still active, only one site had the necessary equipment on hand to deal with temporal anomalies: Temporal Exclusionary Site 37. This Foundation facility had been designed to preserve important records on anomalies in the event that a timeline catastrophe like SCP-001 ever occurred. Through back-and-forth communiques sent via the anomalous homing pigeons, the handful of remaining Foundation operatives agreed that Temporal Exclusionary Site 37 would be dedicated to conduct high-priority research and documentation regarding the time-halting effects of SCP-001. It was also discovered through communications involving SCP-6459 that 2 of the O5 Council remained unaffected by the anomalous event and held an emergency session discussing how to best strategize now that the world had been brought to a standstill. The decision was unanimous. The surviving fragment of the Foundation had to consolidate their remaining resources to enact containment procedures. They needed to start researching SCP-001 immediately and figure out how to reverse it. All Foundation agents still active were given full approval to eliminate any person or group that the O5 Council of 2 deemed to be hostile. or any civilian who was observed trying to oppose the Foundation's mission. Any person affected by SCP-001 was to be considered a loss. Of those still able to move freely despite SCP-001 was Foundation Agent Jesse Kidd. They had been in the field when the temporal anomaly had activated and were still out there all this timeless time later. Hiking through a snow-laden forest, Agent Kidd stopped to observe the world around them, as frozen as the icy woods they were walking through. Snowflakes hung suspended in the air, once blown about on the wind that was now unnaturally still and calm. Agent Kidd examined a leaf on a nearby tree. It didn't yield to their touch. It stayed stuck fast, immovable, impossible to even pluck from the branch it was on. As beautiful as the scene surrounding them was, Agent Kidd couldn't escape how empty and incomplete it all felt. At this moment, the forest that should have been teeming with life was instead frozen in time. It might as well have been dead. Agent Kidd turned their attention inwards, re-examining their injury. They lifted the patch that covered the blood-stained wound over their eye. Pulling their fingers away, they saw it was still bloodied, still fresh and open, even though the injury was at least 30 years old. Most people who were still unaffected by SCP-001 had given up on tracking minutes and hours. Lowering the eye patch, Agent Kidd marked a sigil on a nearby tree, muttering a quiet incantation under their breath. Nothing happened. The Foundation agent was aware they were holding on to a fool's hope. Reaching into their jacket, Agent Kidd pulled a heart from their pocket. It kept beating, almost in defiance of the world around it. Then Kidd pressed it against the sigil and, in a heartbeat, the world around seemed to start moving again. Pulling their jacket closed around them, the Foundation agent shielded themselves from the cold breeze they hadn't felt in, well, time didn't really mean anything anymore. The breeze blew a snowflake onto Kidd's cheek, but before they could start weeping with joy, their nervous system reactivated. Every pain receptor in their body began screaming out in agony, reacting to the traumatic injuries Agent Kidd's body, their eye, their arm, ones that they had even forgotten about. SCP-001 had stopped them, stopped everyone, from healing properly. Battling against the onslaught of pain, Agent Kidd activated a device on their wrist, awakening a dormant artificial intelligence construct. AICs were algorithms that could perform various tasks in order to aid the Foundation, typically by mimicking a human-like personality, despite being little more than a computer program. The one loaded into Agent Kidd's wrist device was known as Cruise.aic, a construct that the Foundation had specifically developed to interface with anomalies and replicate their effects, in order for the Foundation researchers to better observe these SCPs in a contained, localized environment. Upon activating, Kidd demanded that Cruise interface with the anomaly, yelling at it urgently as the construct awoke in confusion as to how it had come to be in the forest. It took a moment to register the command from Agent Kidd, shivers running over their body as they realized, through their time-unfrozen nerves, just how cold they were getting. Identifying the heart and the sigil, Cruise managed to interface with it, causing the forest to once again be brought to a halt. With the silence of the stilled winds, Agent Kidd felt their excruciating pain fade away, replaced by a numbness of their bodily processes all stopping once more. It was a feeling that they had long since grown accustomed to. Before their eyes, a single drop of their blood was hanging suspended in midair, caught by SCP-001's temporal effects before it could stain the stark white snow beneath. Cruise questioned why it could no longer connect to the Foundation's network, unaware of what had transpired while it had been offline. Agent Kidd examined the heart in their hand for a moment. It was still beating. They asked Cruise what it knew about an entity called Eternium. Unable to connect to the Foundation's database, the construct instead referred to its local offline files, aware that the entity being described was a time god of some description, one that had a shrine dedicated to it in the Olympic National Park in Washington. Eternium's shrine, designated by the Foundation as SCP-001-1, was the most recent known location for modern worship of the temporal deity. It had collapsed on the 13th of February, 2025 for unknown reasons. What was known was that when SCP-001-1 was destroyed, the SCP-001 event was triggered, leaving the world frozen as a result. Agent Kidd's plan, as Cruise started to catch up with the little information it had available, was to use the heart they had procured to fix the shrine. and restore the natural flow of time. While Cruz did not have much information on record about Eternium, it had access to a basic backup of the main SCP Foundation database, with clearance up to level 3. Based on that, the construct was able to determine that the shrine was situated in the mountains that lay northwest of the forest. Agent Kidd asked Cruz to calculate a route from their current location to the shrine. As Cruz determined the best route, Kidd sends off their only other companion, one of the SCP-6459 pigeons, a bird named Galnere. With the agent's report tied to its leg, the homing pigeon gives a coo and a thanks in French, before flapping its wings and taking off back towards Temporal Exclusionary Site 37. Calculations complete, Cruz explained that the way to the Shrine of Eternium would take 3 days to reach on foot. Luckily, the agent and the construct literally had all the time in the world. Placing the heart back inside the pocket of their jacket, Agent Kidd felt the slight warmth and gentle beating of the organ. They tapped the sigil one more time, and with a feeling as if this would all be over soon, they set off on the route Cruz had mapped out. The journey was a quiet one, with Cruz only occasionally breaking the silence to alert Kidd when they were about to take a misstep, preventing them from taking a tumble and injuring themselves. After a while, though, Kidd started to feel like they were being watched. They asked Cruz to perform a scan of the area, but before it could reveal what was nearby, a group of figures emerged from behind the trees. There were 10 of them at most, each carrying blades. Their leader, a tall, suited man, approached Kidd and greeted him. The man was Agent Saul, a former operative of the SCP Foundation. He remarked that he was surprised to see Agent Kidd. He received word that one of the Foundation's operatives were operating in the area, but hadn't been expecting it to be an old friend. Noticing the patch over Agent Kidd's eye, he drew a sword, raising the tip to their chin, tilting their head up to look directly at him. He could tell the wound was still fresh, and asked how Kidd had gotten it. The agent tried to dodge Saul's question, only to be met with a hard slap to the face that sent Kidd stumbling back at the sudden, sharp impact. It was at that point that Cruz chimed up, asking who Saul was. While he had formerly been a member of the Foundation, in the wake of the SCP-001 temporal event, Agent Saul had become affiliated with a group that called themselves the Keepers. They were one of the hostile groups the Foundation had identified as trying to oppose their mission, as the Keepers had made a concerted effort to prevent the Foundation from undoing the effects of SCP-001. Saul grabbed Agent Kidd's right arm, just above where their prosthetic limb was. The sword-wielding Keeper hadn't taken their entire arm the previous time they had met. Pressing his blade to the agent's shoulder, Saul demanded Kidd to tell him what they had found and what they knew about the shrine to Eternium. Asking Cruz for help, the construct pointed out Saul's weak stance and that a quick kick to the back of his knees would knock him to the ground. Sure enough, Kidd swept Saul's legs out from under him, causing him to fall to the ground. Before he'd even hit, Agent Kidd was running, while Saul and the rest of his keepers rushed after them. They narrowly dodged a sword swinging through the air as one of Saul's grunts nearly caught up with them. Cruz urged Kidd to pull their gun, but they were unable to use their firearm. Thanks to SCP-001, thermodynamics had also been halted, which was what had prompted the pursuing attackers to use swords instead. Guided by Cruz's quick, computerized thinking, Kidd made an emergency turn that caused the Keeper behind them to catch their foot on a root and fall over. Another one of them tripped over the first, landing on top of his compatriot. Having shaken off Saul's grunts, for now, Kidd came to the edge of a ravine, only to hear a familiar voice behind them. Saul had them cornered, walking out from the undergrowth with his sword drawn and the blade pointed towards Agent Kidd. He insisted that Kidd hand over whatever they had found that could reverse the effects of SCP-001, threatening to use his sword to cleave the Foundation agent in twain. Well, that would normally be enough to kill Agent Kidd. The temporal cessation was able to prevent the pain associated with injuries, putting a pause on the shock and blood loss that would otherwise kill a person. But even without their wounds being able to kill them, Saul intended to leave Kidd as little more than a wounded, broken body laying in the woods. But when Saul rushes at Kidd, they manage to sidestep him, evading the former agent's sloppy, angry, and predictable sword strokes without letting any of them land. Agent Kidd didn't want to hurt Saul, despite him not sharing the same reservations towards them. They rushed at Saul shoulder first, tackling him to the ground. Trying to get back to his feet, the Keeper lost his balance and slipped towards the ravine. Rushing forwards, Agent Kidd grabbed him, met with a look of shocked confusion from Saul, who reached out and grabbed their prosthetic limb. Despite Kid's best efforts, the Keeper pulls their prosthetic off, losing his grip and falling into the ravine below. They lean forward to try and catch him, but overextend in the process and start tumbling forwards, toppling into the ravine right behind Saul. While the fall into the ravine would have otherwise killed both agents, if not left unconscious at the very least, instead the two managed to get back to their feet, although not quite unscathed. Saul's shoulder was dislocated, Kid's own arm missing their prosthetic. Neither one of them could feel the pain from their injuries, allowing them to continue their scuffle for a moment. But eventually, an uneasy truce formed between the present and former Foundation agents, with Saul amazed that Kid had some Foundation technology still working, namely, Cruz. Agent Kid reattached their makeshift prosthetic. Having been made from plastic odds and ends held together by rubber bands, it had miraculously survived the fall. They explained calmly that they were heading to the Shrine of Eternum and showed the heart to Saul, divulging their intention to restore it once they reached their destination. He was barely able to believe that the remnants of the Foundation were still serious about undoing the effects of SCP-001 until Kid lifted their eye patch and once again drew the sigil with the blood from their wound. As Saul protested and drew his sword, telling Kid he couldn't let that happen, the agent pointed out to him and the other keepers they had forgotten what it was like when time flowed normally by pressing the heart to the sigil and reminding him. Agent Saul grabbed his shoulder in pain as the world began to move again, yelling in pain at his dislocated joint, while Kid tried their best to hide the immense pain they were in. Removing the heart from the sigil, they told Saul that the world couldn't stay in empty eternity, despite his protests that the same empty eternity was keeping them both alive by suppressing their injuries. If Kid succeeded in reaching the shrine and stopping SCP-001, then they would surely die. Yet they couldn't be shaken from their mission. Reluctantly, Saul begrudgingly agreed to travel with them as the pair of them set off on the route Cruz had mapped out. After a perilous trek, the two approached the shrine. As Kid noted in their report, the destruction of the shrine and the subsequent triggering of SCP-001 hadn't happened in an instant. It had been a gradual process, as human traditions and customs changed over time. The shrine to Eternium had fallen into disuse. The time god had been replaced by new deities. While those that mankind once worshipped faded from history, their stories no longer being passed on. Where Saul had expected to see a grand, opulent shrine, there was little more than a pile of carved rubble with a vaguely humanoid statue in the center. On Kid's request, Cruz confirmed what they needed to do. Despite its wear, the shrine remained sturdy, likely thanks to the anomalous materials used to construct it. Still, it needed some degree of reconstruction. Then the heart could be inserted, acting as a keystone that would get time moving once again. Both Kid and Saul knew that this whole ordeal had been going on for so long, and was such a wild exposure of the world to anomalies, that the Foundation would likely be carrying out some thorough amnestics distribution when things started back up again. Even if either of them survived their injuries once time restarted, it was likely they would forget the whole ordeal. Kid expressed that they hoped they did remember, and as the pair of them got to work, helping each other with construction, they exchanged heartfelt words. Agent Kid told Saul that he didn't have to come all this way to help, the Keeper joking that the agent would have had no hope of lifting the rubble of the shrine by themselves. It was true that Kid had started out as a researcher, although they were far from helpless. After all, they'd beaten Agent Saul in a fight, with the help of Cruz at least. As they repaired the shrine, Kid began to feel a rising sense of dread, their muscles tensing as they realized in all likelihood they were about to die. Their injuries were too extreme, and even with Saul alongside them, there was no way any Foundation medics would arrive in enough time. Saul told them there was no need to put on a brave face, and the two looked out at the scenery surrounding them. From the mountain, the nearby city of Port Angeles looked breathtaking in the distance, as the morning sun peeked over the horizon, still and unmoving in the sky, bathing the area in orange light. There were worse places to die, Saul admitted. The two of them continued working, hauling the remaining stone to the top of Eternium's shrine. All that was left to do was put the keystone, the heart, in its rightful place. The chest of the humanoid statue sat in the center. Drawing the sigil once more, Agent Kid removed the heart from their jacket and handed it to Saul. If the Keeper wanted to, he could easily destroy it, and keep the empty eternity going forever. Looking at the heart beating in Kid's hands, Saul admitted that maybe it was time for a change. He inserted the heart into the shrine, and in an instant, the two agents felt the change. Heat from the sunlight, the cold mountain breeze, the agony from their injuries. Kid and Saul both collapsed, pulling each other close, taking their first breaths in 30 years. Everything hurt so much, yet they felt so alive. The pair of them quietly watch as the sun climbed higher, quiet for a moment, an actual moment. They cry years' worth of tears as a breeze carries with it the sound of birds. Agent Kid and Agent Saul wished each other good morning as the world breathed again. Now check out SCP-001 when day breaks, and SCP-001 You Are the Anomaly for more.